Hello and welcome. My name is Kara Laney, and I am the study director for the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I am the director of the study on the potential for biotechnology to address forest health, and we're happy today to welcome our speakers, committee members, and members of the public joining us for this webinar. Before we get started with today's presentations, I'd like to give a bit of background about the study. The committee has a statement of task which can be found on its website, nas.edu/forestbiotech. The statement of task guides the committee's work for the duration of the study and will culminate in a consensus report. Today's webinar is an information gathering session. The committee will use webinars like this one and presentations at in-person meetings to help it assemble materials to examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations in its final report. As this is an information gathering session, I ask everyone to be mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions, and comments made by members of the committee today should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the National Academies. I also want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session, and this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the study's website in a week's time. When it is finished gathering its data, the committee will write a draft report that will go through the National Academy's review process before it is made publicly available. We anticipate that the report will be released towards the end of this year. Short biographies of today's speakers can be found on the study's website. They will each present for about 20 minutes, and we'll have time for questions of clarification from the committee after each talk, followed by Q&A after all three presentations. We will not be taking questions from the public at this time, but if you'd like to leave a comment or share information with the committee, please submit it via the website, which again is nas.edu/forestbiotech. There's a button on the home page called Provide Input, and you can click it to write comments or upload documents. Before we get started, I'd also like to remind everybody to keep their lines on mute when they're not speaking. That helps us hear the speakers more clearly. With that, I'd like to welcome Neil Patterson, BG McNamara, and Mike Dockery to today's webinar, and thank them for taking the time to join us today. Neil, we'll start with you.
I'm going to try to share the screen now, I think.
Looks like, yep, success. We can see your home.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Neil Patterson Jr. I'm from the Tuscarora Nation. I'm a member of the White Bear Clan, and I serve as Assistant Director for the SUNY ESF Center for Native Peoples and the Environment in Syracuse, New York, on the territory of the Onondaga Nation. I have a photo here in the beginning slide of some of the wonderful American chestnut flowers that used to cover a large portion of Haudenosaunee territory. So what I'd like to talk to you a bit about today is our work surrounding the transgenic chestnut that's being developed here in Syracuse, New York, by scientists and biotechnologists at SUNY ESF. Our work is part of a partnership with North Carolina State University, looking at 4 core stakeholders in the biotech area: biotechnologists, the general public, NGOs, and finally indigenous stakeholders. I've been a member of the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. Haudenosaunee, for those of you that don't know, is our word for the Iroquois Confederacy. 6 member nations, Tuscarora being one of them, and we are really looking at this project from kind of a linguistic point of view. Language has been a big part of my my upbringing and my identity as a Haudenosaunee person and as a Tuscarora Nation citizen. And we'll be presenting on some of our findings in North Carolina this spring at the Public Perceptions of American Chestnut Restoration and Next Steps for Engagement. So I just want to share a little bit. We're sort of midway through our work right now, working with linguists to think about biotechnology and genetically modified organisms. The chestnut, of course, was a major species. One could even argue maybe a cultural keystone species of the Haudenosaunee people. You know, our range pre-Revolutionary War went all the way down to the Carolinas, where my ancestors were at the time of contact, all the way up to the upper reaches of the St. Lawrence River. We have a number of stories about the chestnut in our history, and in particular, a number of references to it as food, of course. And I just want to share a little bit about sort of the cultural background that came along with the chestnut. And by the way, I'm actually doing this from home today because of this massive storm that swept over New York. So if you hear my kids or strange parakeets in the background, you have to just roll with it today. So I always like to start out about thinking about our relationship with trees, plants, the flora, the fauna of Turtle Island from our creation story. If we look at some of the recent work on traditional ecological knowledge, understanding that it's really embedded within Indigenous people's creation stories and how they relate to the places around them, we find, at least for the Haudenosaunee, that our seeds and the gift of the flora in particular were brought here to Turtle Island by a woman that we call Sky Woman. And you can see in her left hand here a bundle of twigs and seeds that she grabbed from the sky world. And so one of our dominant frameworks about how our relationship is with plants in particular is one of a gift. This is essentially a gift economy here on Turtle Island, and we view this source of life as a gift from Creator through this woman who fell to the earth to create life on the back of this giant turtle that rose up from the ocean. Our relationship with these gifts amongst each other is also defined by kind of a second, more political aspect, and that is one of the first natural resource policies, is the way I like to term this wampum belt, called the dish with one spoon. And so the chestnut, along with all of the other flora of Turtle Island, are kind of represented as being in this dish. And our job as Haudenosaunee people, as human beings on this earth, is to share that dish with one spoon. That's one of our foundational teachings. It came along with the message of the Great Peace to Onondaga territory, probably between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago. And our instructions really are to share that dish with one spoon, and we are never to use forks and knives to sort of partition that up. And I think that's pretty apparent when you enter our communities today, and there's a real noticeable lack of things like fences or posted signs. All of the land is held communally in our territories, with families and clans and individuals having sort of life use of the territory, or we sometimes call them landholders for future generations. So what is in this dish? This dish spreads today across upstate New York. This is an old map kind of identifying some of the old Haudenosaunee settlements. And our place names for these settlements. This is a little bit of a zoom in here in Western New York, right near the city of Buffalo. So you'll see in the sort of lower left-hand side, the city of Buffalo on Lake Erie. And one of the things that fascinated me growing up and thinking about the language and thinking about relationship to place is the translation of these names. And in the case of Buffalo, the Siohwe, this is a place that's in our older brother's territory, the Seneca Nation. And the very root of that word itself is ahosta. Ahosta, of course, in our language means basswood, the basswood tree. And so when we go back to think about all of these places in our territory, we find many place names that are actually what some current ecologists would call reference ecosystems in a way. They serve as a template for restoration and understanding thousands of years of occupation in these places and a relationship with trees like the basswood. Schenectady is another name that we have in our older brother, the Mohawks and Onondagas territory, that means the place beyond the jack pine, which is a unique ecosystem on the eastern door of the Confederacy near Albany, New York, today called Schenectady. But Haudenosaunee people, the point here is that Haudenosaunee people were calling these places and referencing them in terms of the relationship with plants and trees for thousands of years. Very little work has been done in this area in terms of relating Haudenosaunee place names as a guide for ecological restoration. There is also a very active and strong movement within our communities, not only to relate to places, but to relate to food sources. And I think this is really where the chestnut comes in when we see such a long history of relationship with chestnut as food and, of course, other trees. You will see on the right-hand side of the screen is where we are today. Some indigenous people call this the rounds, the seasonal rounds. We view this as kind of a cycle of ceremonies. This is the cycle that we are part of as Haudenosaunee people on the land. And right now we are in the middle of Wata. Tuscaroras call it Uchigeta, but on the right side you'll see that pail hanging from the tree. And so I've been spending the last few nights gathering sap from Wata, the maple tree, who is considered the leader of the trees in our Haudenosaunee oral tradition. And so communities have taken on this really tall order to think about how human beings fit within these cycles, and have driven a lot of our food sovereignty efforts, our traditional agricultural restoration programs, and our ecological restoration programs as well, as we think about all of those native species that were put here by creation for the people to enjoy, to look at, to hear, to taste, to touch, to see. This is really important work. And had we, someday the dream is that we would see the chestnut in this cycle very clearly, and that our children and our grandchildren and our future generations would make that part of their seasonal rounds or cycle of ceremonies as well. We find plenty of great references to chestnut in the ethno-historical literature. F.W. Waugh was one of the first scientists to think about describing Haudenosaunee diets and food uses. And Arthur Parker, of course, much later on, kind of built on that, showing the intense use of chestnuts in mixing with other foods. And there is a very elaborate story, actually, Odadeno and Yetyanwetus, recorded by a Tuscarora linguist by the name of J.N.B. Hewitt for the Smithsonian Institution back in the early 20th century. The story talks about the gift of the chestnut, and one of the main messages that we find in there is that this chestnut is to be shared with the rest of the human beings on the earth. And this is where you can actually start to see on the right-hand side a little bit of the terminology related to our nut culture. Many people actually talk about our nut culture as one of the original seed cultures of the Haudenosaunee people, and the very easily adopted technology of corn actually coming from the long relationship and history we had with nut foods themselves. And so we are currently in the process of looking at these recipes, these references, and reinstituting them in our community. If we were to take a closer look at the language itself, which is really the focus of our effort, we find that the Tuscarora, like the other 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, are all related. These are the numbers in the Iroquois Language Association, 1 through 5, and you can see this pattern across history. Some of these languages have unfortunately gone extinct. Some of them were near extinction and are currently being recovered, like the Huron, but certainly the Susquehannock and the St. Lawrence language groups here of this Iroquois Association are no longer with us. And so it just shows this across this massive dish, across the territory of the chestnut tree, we find a common language, a common vernacular for our worldviews. And this is really where biotechnology for Haudenosaunee people, I think, is the first step, is kind of thinking about what is the word for biotechnology in Tuscarora? What is the word for biotechnology or the transgenic chestnut in Onondaga? Do we have words like these? Well, we don't. This is the challenge in front of us. And much like biotechnology, which is an emerging way to shape the world, it is the very same thing as creating new words in our Haudenosaunee dialects. And so for hundreds of years, Haudenosaunee people and Cherokee people and Nottoway and Wyandotte people have all had to come up with words for things like trains and cars and computers and televisions. And the process of creating a new word, which is called neologism, I think is a very interesting metaphor in many ways for addressing biotechnology in our own cultures, in our own worldview. I won't get into too much about how the language is put together, but it's safe to say that it's so different from English because it's a polysynthetic language. Our language, we have the ability to merge pronouns, verbs, nouns, and aspects into one word itself. And on the screen here, you can see the difficulty in a way in translating Haudenosaunee languages, because these two words, akri'e'a and akri'atu, essentially mean uncle. But in order to appreciate the differences here, we have to think about how we related to each other, much like we have to think about how we relate to the chestnut tree and to transgenic science and to biotechnology. The difference in these words is pretty clear to any Haudenosaunee person who can see that we are a matrilineal society. And so when we think about our uncle on our father's side, akri'e'a, it's really a modification of the word father. But because Haudenosaunee people have such close ties to their mother's side in our matrilineal society, there is a very specific noun root completely reserved for maternal uncles. They're much different in how we relate to these individuals. Yet if you were to see a literal translation of some of this old language by linguists, you might not be able to see that distinction if you simply use the English word for uncle. So what are the words we've been looking at, of course? You see chestnut featured here, but we also have to think about all of the other relationships to all of the other hardwood nut trees that we have. Taking a sort of a long view of nut culture in Haudenosaunee society and thinking about what are the root words here being employed? What are the root verbs that we see in these, what English would call nouns? And so this is our job currently, is to kind of unpack these relationships we have with chestnut as well as our other plant helpers on Turtle Island. So when we think about the verbs of biotechnology, many things are coming to mind in some of our speakers. The idea of life, of giving life, of changing life. There's some really unique verbs in Haudenosaunee culture that actually talk about reemergence of life or remaking life. And pairing that verb with the nouns that we have for nut and seed and tree, I think is part of this process. And this is just a sort of simple breakdown, what we call a 5-line translation of any verb or noun or phrase in Haudenosaunee language. And this one is in particular in Onondaga that we're looking at here by a linguist we're working with, Dr. Percy Abrams, who is helping us to interview elders and to think about the 5-line translation. And so the top line is the way that we would say it, Jon Hekwi on the top left there, and how that can be broken down into its particles, into its aspects, into its pronouns. And this is very important for Haudenosaunee people because unlike English, which most speakers use probably in the range of 2 nouns to every 1 verb, Haudenosaunee people actually use about 5 verbs for every 1 noun. And so our worldview, our look at biotechnology, our look at the transgenic chestnut probably is unavoidably verb-based. It has to do with what we call verbing. Our language is so alive and so descriptive that the verb that I'd like to use is called verbing. Our language is constantly verbing. And so we can find relationships between nouns or between people and places and people and plants if we are very carefully paying attention to this type of translation. Unfortunately, as many of you know, our language is one of the most, has taken one of the most precipitous turns in terms of traditional knowledge in our communities. And this is a graph, a slide created by Dr. Robin Kimmerer, who's director of the center at ESF, kind of looking at the status over time of this type of knowledge. And so for Tuscarora, this is critical because we have less than a handful. In fact, some people say we really only have 1 person left in the world who is fluent in Tuscarora. And he's in his 80s and he lives, I grew up next to him, and he's working hard with many young people at Tuscarora to recover and record the language. This is also related in many ways, language restoration, to restoration of a relationship with place. And the treaties that we have across that massive dish that we started the presentation out, the treaties that promised the rights of the Haudenosaunee to be able to hunt and fish and gather and do ceremony across the land, not just on the reservation, but in our Aboriginal, our original territories and our original rivers and lakes and forests is a big part of our work as well. And it's a constant battle that we are facing to say, what is our relationship with chestnut if it's not growing on our reservation? And so part of the work that I do is really taking young people out into the field and looking at forested ecosystems that they may have never experienced before at all, and trying to develop relationships with our the type of relationships that our original ancestors had. And for one of the more recent focus in our communities has really to do with going back to those seasonal rounds in terms of food sovereignty. In my community at Tuscarora, I am constantly asked by our farmers and our women, what are we going to do about the influx of genetically modified corn pollen on our own original corn varieties, our open pollinated heirloom corn varieties, and of which one of the most famous is the Tuscarora white corn, which you can see these young men have braided up in the lower right. And so one of the challenges is working with farmers who continue to plant non-traditional varieties of corn in close proximity to our traditional corn plantations. And this is one area that has led many people in our community to consider bans on genetically modified organisms, really stemming from the protection of the genetics of our original seed corn. The Haudenosaunee have at least 20 different varieties of open pollinated corn that we are growing in our communities today. And the threat of that corn, or I should say the threat of not being able to produce pure seed for future generations is a real threat. And I just want to finish up here by thinking about one of my mentors, Dr. John Mohawk, a Seneca man who is kind of one of the leading scholars in thinking about what are the laws of biotechnology, what are the laws of how we work with nature, because the Haudenosaunee people had such a long history of plant breeding in our communities. And we appreciate the work of our ancestors that went into breeding these different corn varieties and bean varieties. We understand that we have lived and worked and shaped the environment around us for the benefit of our future generations. And it was Dr. Mohawk who really said it is our job in terms of measuring how we do that to fit within these cycles as much as we can. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening, and I turn it back over to Kara, I guess.
Thank you, Neil. Are there any questions of clarification from the committee for Neil at this time? Okay, then we'll hold our questions for Neil until after we hear from the other two speakers. BJ, you should be able to share your screen now.
Neil, can you click the stop share button first at the top? There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the committee and all the organizers and the people that are presenting. Thank you, Neil. I'm always reminded how vibrant and still alive our Haudenosaunee people are. I'm also of Haudenosaunee descent, the Seneca Nation. And can you see my screen? Hello?
We can.
Okay, hold on. I've done something wrong. Let's see. Oh, share screen. Oh, here I am. Can you see it now?
No, it's still not up.
Share screen. I don't mean to be so. How's that?
I think it's coming online. There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. And let me go on. And I'm always really heartened to realize that, you know, our peoples are working to revitalize and to keep our traditions and our languages alive for our next 7 generations. So let me begin. There we go. All right, there's my thank you to the organizers of this. I know how much work goes into it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this study. As Neil so rightly and wonderfully identified, that we as Indigenous people have been part of the evolution of the world for just about ever. We're here, so that kind of proves it. And every geological area has its own unique complexities in maintaining the biodiversity of all the ecosystems. And we realize that modern science is still learning and understanding what Indigenous peoples have known for millennia. We've been part of the changes. We've created our foods, and we want to protect our foods. And I want to make it real clear that I don't represent a nation or a tribe. I'm here as representative of the Indigenous Environmental Network and our partners who are very involved in the advancement of biotechnology in our food, and now in our in restoration or protection of our forests. So you know, this presentation is built on what we already know. When we're talking about forest restoration or forest protection, we have very little very little knowledge of what the impacts may be. So when we're talking about this, we can only base our perspectives or our positions on what we already know. And we're skeptical at best of employing biotechnology to manage or eradicate diseases. And we're fairly aware that containment of a genetically engineered tree, plant, or microorganisms, you know, it's not going to be contained in one area, because our planet, our home, Mother Earth, is constantly changing, and we're constantly sharing everything that we have. So, you know, I tried to take questions from a couple of different lists that were sent to me that the committee wanted to answer. And to make this presentation relevant, I kind of took a little bit of this and a little bit of that so that I could present our position. So when we're talking about science and biotechnology or genetic engineering, the historical evidence and the consequences that we see is that biotechnology really hasn't lived up to its promises. You know, the BT corn was supposed to reduce or eliminate pesticides altogether, and the pathogen or the pest that's threatening our corn crops, our agricultural industrial corn crops, has mutated. And so now, along with growing the BT corn, we also have to use more pesticides. Herbicides the same way. Plants, the competing plants. I also have to say that there's really no such thing as a weed in the definition of a non-useful plant. Most plants have a purpose, whether it's for human nutrition or health or medicine. It still has a place in our world, in nature. It's part of natural law. It's part of the world. It has its own original instructions, and what we're most concerned about is if we start genetically engineering these organisms, that their original instructions will be lost. So again, evidence, another promise from biotechnology was that, there would be higher yields so that we could grow more food on less acreage. And there's a link there for people when you put this up on the website. So another question, it had to do with potential ecological and economic impacts. Well, for far too long, we have thought of nature as a commodity. Anything in nature, it's ours. We can use it. We can manipulate it. We can change it to whatever want we have. So biotechnology is now is being used and is planning to be used for biomass to grow trees quickly and efficiently in plantation style configurations, so that we can grow them in 5 to 7 years. We can cut them down and we can burn them. So looking at the forest as a cash crop, because of the quote unquote healthy forest plan, we're harvesting wood and what they call understory and all that, so we can burn it for energy. It's been touted as being carbon neutral, but research and evidence shows us that that is really not the case. And one of the things that we're really concerned about with biotechnology and trees and forests is that the people in South America and Southeast Asia for a couple of decades now have been suffering from tree plantations for commodities, whether it be eucalyptus for pulp and paper or palm oil. They have been evicted from their traditional lands. They've lost their subsistence rights, and they've also now started to use it for carbon trading and carbon offsets. The problem is that a lot of people think that carbon offsets, carbon trading, well, look, they're saving forests, they're saving rainforests, but that's not necessarily the case. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization defines forest with anything with a certain amount of canopy, tree cover. So, we're still losing our rainforests. We're still losing all of the resources in those forests, things that we don't even know we have now, and we're losing them before we can even look at them as medicines or nutrition that we need for our own human health. So the extreme extractive economy is one of the things that's threatening our forests, whether that be mountaintop coal removal, whether it be pipelines, whether it be oil drilling or coal mining or uranium mining. All of the extractive economy is threatening our forests, and the forest is part of that extractive economy. So, we have to look at how we can shore up our forests, how we can make them more healthy. And one of the ways that we talk about a lot is leaving these forests alone and looking at our traditional indigenous ecological knowledge in the way to do that. And I don't mean, totally not walking on the lands or harvesting from the lands, but we need to do it in a way that we've done it for countless generations, and keep track of it and monitor it and work with it. And it's a radical idea because, economies, right? With that said, there's several tribal nations that have forest economic plans and things they do. They're wonderful. They harvest their wood, they make the environment around it more healthy, and they take it all in a holistic manner. And another element of it, I would say, is if we're thinking about biotechnology to make our forests more resistant to climate change, or to deal with pests and pathogens that are threatening several species of trees right now, the question would be, are we able to predict what those climate changes are going to be? 10, 20, 30 years from now. And trees themselves take 10, 20, 30 years to mature. So are we really helping it? Are we able to employ biotechnology or genetic engineering to do this? If we place genetically engineered trees into an already stressed environment, are we asking that environment to do too much? Are we bucking natural law, so to speak? So, you know, these are some of the questions that we're asking. And I have more questions than I have answers, unfortunately. So another question was, and I didn't put the full question up there, but it was more or less, how is the regulatory system in line with tribal systems of the same kind? Well, right now, and for probably the last 10, 15 years, maybe longer, our regulatory system has been usurped by industry pressures. Industry research is taken as gospel. It is used in approving some of these things, whether it be pesticides, herbicides, even with a wealth of research and scientific knowledge that says that these things are harmful to our environment, to across the board. You can see water, air, land. We're losing our pollinators because the neonicotinoids were approved, regardless of the scientists, even within the EPA and the other agencies. They knew that these chemicals were highly toxic to our pollinators. Of course, it's still out for, jury's still out on that one, they say, but the evidence kind of piles up on it. So again, I'm looking at forest health and forest restoration based on the things that we already know are happening. So, more questions, and I'm not really sure that we're approaching it right. And everyone, unless you've been living under a rock, you know that our government and our administration is really out of control. They're removing any references to climate change. They're removing scientific information, years and years of scientific research and evidence of the things that we need to take into consideration when we're making any move. So, last few years they approved 2 trees, the loblolly pine and the Arctic apple, without any public input, which is the highest form of disrespect for the citizens and for the people who may suffer from the consequences of these. I don't know about everybody else, but I'd like to know if my apple has been, thrown around or it's was on the ground, or it's been out in the air too long. It was designed to be able to put apple slices in kids' Happy Meals and not have to spray them with a lemon type substance so they wouldn't brown in the bag. Another thing that we're doing, that we're separating our children from the source of their food, from the connection to their food, from the connection to the world and natural law and our original instructions. And we can't emphasize enough our original instructions. So, our confidence in the industry is really not good. So, and in the case of the loblolly pine, it was designed for the wood to be denser, so that would be better for construction and all the things that they use for pine for. But the problem is it's denser, so the woodpecker, the red cockaded woodpecker, that the loblolly pine forests are their territory. And if the wood is denser, will the food that they get out of the wood, will the food be able to get into the wood, the bugs and the grubs and the worms, and will they be able to use their beaks and get it out? So that's another question. Currently, those trees have not been planted. They haven't replaced the current loblolly pine forests in the southern part of the United States, but it is possible. So, public opinion, that's a big one. That's why we're doing this. That's why I was part of a survey, and I've been a small part of the study that Neil and Katie and Jason and a few other people are part of. You know, we want to kind of take the temperature, if you will, of the public. So, you know, I'm out there in different meetings and conferences with indigenous peoples, with regional tribal governments, with colleges, land grant colleges, the First Americans land grant colleges. And when I talk to people, when I let them know what's going on, which a good many of them didn't, you know, GE trees, genetically engineered trees wasn't even on their radar. So, but their first reaction is skepticism, and some are even very opposed to it. I know when I talk to elders, our medicine people, they're very concerned. Again, the original instructions, our relationship to the plant world. The efficacy of our medicines is based on the relationship of the medicine person and the plant nations. So we are very worried that these relationships will be severed, that the efficacy of our medicines will be challenged. Again, historical, you know, evidence and things that have already taken place. Can we trust biotechnology? Monsanto was just found out to sponsor and provide all of the text or content for an article that was against organic gardening, organic products. The poison papers, that was something that was found in a garage, and it listed all of the things that these companies knew that was going to be wrong with their chemicals, and they're still being gone through. So, you know, we've been victim of some of this opposition. We've been called crazy, and we've been called, you know, we're against science and we're against technology, and that is probably farthest from the truth. I absolutely am blessed by the relationships that I have with different scientists. They spend time explaining to me, you know, what I don't know, and I'm humbled by their dedication to the well-being of our next generations, and their you know, they're partnering with us and working with us. So that's couldn't be further from the truth. And it was said to me, and it's been said a couple times in regard to the genetically engineered chestnut, that the work being done by the American Chestnut Foundation has been going on for maybe 2-3 decades, and they're breeding a Chinese chestnut with an American chestnut. The Chinese chestnut has the resistance gene in it to the blight. They've had some pretty good success. They're back crossing, and they're hoping that this will return the American chestnut to its original territories. And the argument that I got was it was taking too long. We need to do it faster. We got to do it faster. And I called this the fast food mentality. Everything now has to be done quickly. We can't think. We have to just react. And we see evidence of, you know, the mistakes that we're making by not taking time and really thinking about what the consequences are going to be. We know that genes and all of these organisms, they don't exist in a bubble. So that everything that we do has consequences. And that is the same in the forests, in the grasslands, or wherever we are. So when we make these molecular changes, we're changing this plant or this organism forever. And so we need to ask, what are the consequences of that? Another emerging genetic technology, biotechnology, is gene editing. CRISPR-Cas9, and there's a whole lot of other ones. I put a lot of text on this page, so I didn't go into all of the different methods and methodologies, but we're still changing a plant. We're still changing an organism. And it has the potential to absolutely destroy anything that we might want it to destroy. We take amaranth for example. Amaranth, or pigweed, is a huge pest for corn. Farmers would just love to get rid of it. but it's also a food for millions of people around the world. And if they decide that this needs to be done because that's the only way that we're going to save the corn, then we may be talking about genocide. And it's extreme, and but it has to be thought about. So there's just too much we don't know. So we have to employ the precautionary principle. Quite simply, the precautionary principle is just because we can doesn't mean we should. It's a whole lot more complicated. If you're not familiar with it, just Google it and you'll probably find more information that you need. Also, humans, all of these things that we're facing now, all of the forest things that are destroying our forest have come because of us, because of globalization. So, we keep doing these things and we think that there's this risk and that risk, but by the time that happens, we'll figure out how to fix it. This isn't the movies. There's not going to be some guy on a white horse with a big white hat rolling in and fixing these problems. Haven't fixed them yet, and I don't know if it's possible. But we have to think about the steps that we're taking to combat or mitigate or stop the things that are threatening our forests and our biodiversity. So, is it smart to be running in and doing this? That's the question we're asking. So, and a couple grannies and some aunties, they also said, we made these mistakes, so maybe we have to live with them. It's a hard lesson. It's kind of like when you were growing up and you did something wrong and you had to pay the price. So I don't know if we're ready to pay the price. I don't know if we want to pay the price, but it's again a question that we have to ask. In regard to the American chestnut, we look at this as this being more altruistic, but it's also a way to garner public acceptance. So, some of my colleagues, they call it a Trojan horse. I don't kind of go that far, but it is. It's a way to, they're giving the tree away, and this is good, and maybe some of the other things they're doing is good. I don't know, but what we do know is that there's not a place on this earth that we're not stressing in some ways, whether it be through air pollution, through degradation of our water and our land, and the resource extractions. So, the question was asked how Indigenous understandings of forest health restoration and genetic engineering can complement or challenge Western viewpoints. Well, I'm challenging Western viewpoints right now, and I will continue to challenge them because Indigenous people since they landed over here from Europe have been forcing on us their will to change the way of life. So we kind of call that the same cavalry, different day. And genetic engineering, biotechnology, it's kind of the same thing, because we really do feel that we're kind of up against it, because there's a lot of power, there's a lot of money, and there's a lot of pressures. So again, I'm great respect for scientists, researchers, community, and tribal peoples. Our Indigenous opposition is based on the evidence that we already have, and ultimately we ask that the opportunities the opportunity we have, and we're not prevented from being part of this conversation and interjecting traditional Indigenous knowledge. We have to listen to our elders and to our medicine people and to the wisdom of our ancestors. So I'm going to wrap it up now. Hope I didn't go too much over. I've put a list of some of the references that I've used over the course of my work. Also, my website is there. Our Indigenous Environmental Network website is there. And the other one, the NORAD.com, goes into carbon trading, carbon offsets, and the effects it's having on the peoples in the global south. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening. If you have any questions, there's absolutely no way I can put everything in here in 20 minutes. So I hope it made sense, and I am available for discussion, and I'm going to be out there in the community talking. So I hope to see some of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, BJ. We have time for quick questions of clarification from the committee. Okay, hearing none, we'll go to Mike. So if BJ has stopped sharing her screen, then Mike, you should be able to share yours. And it looks like you're up. And Mike, we can't hear you yet, so you need to unmute your line and move your presentation to presentation mode.
Yeah, I keep clicking on it, and there we go.
Okay, yep, we see it.
Okay, Bonjour Nikon. I'm Mike Dockery. I work for the Forest Service and have adjunct appointments at the University of Minnesota in Forestry and American Indian Studies. I just wanted to start off by thanking the committee and the National Academies of Sciences for having us here. It's a real honor to present with Neil and BJ and be a part of this discussion. And as I think BJ was saying several times, you know, Indigenous people have really been left out of some of these conversations. And I think for me, at least, it's really heartening to have this as something that you are all doing up front and thinking about, because I don't think it happens enough. I'll kind of go through this fast because we're a little bit over time, but I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and I'll show a map in a little bit, but our traditional territory is from sort of around southern Lake Michigan in the Lake States. And my tribe, my family was removed from that area to Oklahoma. I've been doing work with Indigenous peoples for my entire career, aside from being a tribal member. And I hope to provide a broad kind of overview and things to think about as the committee moves forward with this project. So I'm going to give a quick intro brief on American Indian lands, a little bit about tribal relations, and then I'll get into some perspectives on biotechnology and forest health. And hopefully then we can have a discussion here. There are over, at this point, 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Just recently, there were half dozen or so tribes recognized in Virginia. That's a lot of tribes. Those are all sovereign nations. Those are all people with governments, people with unique cultures, language, historical experience. Of these, about 300 some have significant forest lands totaling about 18 million acres. And I'll show a map in a second showing some of that. I always say that it's important to recognize that, as we've heard from the two other presentations, tribes have managed their lands for many, many goals for many generations. And this management has happened through change, social change, ecological change. And the final point on this slide I want to make is that it's important to keep in mind all of these forests were once tribal forests. Tribes are managing all of our forests in North America. And that's important as we think about the future and how we propose to manage forests in the future. We need to respect that tribal sovereignty and that tribal knowledge. So here's a map of federal Indian lands and federal lands and then Indian reservations. So the red, you can see those are the reservations. The other colors are the other federal lands. So these are just federal lands, not forests. And you can see, yes, there's lots of tribal lands throughout the United States. There's also lots of federal land. specifically on federal land, when we make decisions for forest management, we are required by law to consult with tribes and work with tribes on those decisions. And this comes through our treaties with the tribes. This is because of our US Constitution, case law, executive orders from the president. I'm with USDA Forest Service, so our USDA regulations say we have to do this, and so does the Forest Service handbook, right? Every federal agency is legally required to consult with tribes and work with tribes on their projects. I think that's important. And I think that's important if we're, if some of the proposals have to do with federal lands. But I also will just add, again, keep in the back of your mind that all forest lands were once tribal lands, and that tribes have an interest, even if it isn't a federal forest or even if it isn't reservation forest. And as we know, tribes have used forests and worked with forests for many different things: materials for cultural activities, hunting and fishing, spiritual, religious ceremonies, access to sacred sites. Here's my first point, I guess, to think about that I've been making here, is that tribes are diverse. And so when we think about biotechnology and forest health, what is a tribal perspective? Well, tribes are diverse. We have over 570 federally recognized tribes. That doesn't count state recognized tribes or unrecognized tribes, right? Those tribes are all diverse. They have their own governments, their own cultures. And I also want to say within tribes, there's diversity as well. So there's groups of people that have different knowledges throughout the tribal communities. I live here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. We have one of the largest urban Indian populations in the US. We have a lot of tribal members that are urban, right? We don't have large forests right here in the middle of the city. But these voices and these diverse perspectives are important when we're talking about how do we manage forests and move forward. So there's no one indigenous perspective. There's no one American Indian perspective. There's even, within the tribes, I said, there's diversity in opinion. And so there's going to be different perspectives on things, and especially on controversial topics like bioengineering, biotechnology. A second point I want to put out there to think about is that tribes are resilient and forward thinking, right? We've been here for thousands of years, and we're still here, and we're still managing our forests, living with our forests, and thinking about what that means for not only our future generations of humans, but the future of the forest itself. And so this is an example of what I'm going to show as resiliency, or how to think about incorporating tribal perspectives in resilience thinking. So I got this actually from Neil's counterpart at ESF, Robin Kimmer. So she talked about this once, and it really hit home with me. But here's a map from a climate change report done for the Lake States region in 2003. And it's showing summer temperatures, changing summers in the Midwest. What would summers look like in basically 2095, according to some of the climate models? Okay, what we see is Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. These places are starting to look like Oklahoma. Illinois is starting to look like Texas, right? That's a pretty abrupt change. It's very striking. But when we look back in history, well, my tribe experienced this type of change. Here's a map. I'll do my cursor here. This is Lake Michigan, right? This up here. And we were removed, right? All the way down to Kansas. Now my tribe's in Oklahoma. There's another Potawatomi tribe in Kansas. Right? We experienced this type of not only ecological change, but massive social change in the 1830s. We have this experience. And today our tribe is strong. We have regained and we've maintained traditional knowledge and understandings of the world. And we have a lot of experience, practical experience of how to deal with some of this change, right? We are resilient and forward thinking, and incorporating tribal perspectives will help us make better decisions as we move forward with natural resource management. And here's a picture I took from Sarah Hoagland. I saw her name on the thing. These are some of her students, but I just love this picture. My third point on this is that many tribal communities see plants, animals, and our ecosystems as our relatives. As our relatives. And that's easy to say, but we need to really think about what that means when we're talking about biotechnology, right? Those are my kids there on the upper left. Those are big trees from Menominee Reservation at the turn of the last century. Those are relatives. Birch bark. But what does that mean to be relatives when we're thinking about biotechnology? Would you genetically modify your children? Right? These are what tribal communities are thinking about often. What about your parents, your grandparents? When would it be acceptable? If you have a cancer that's so severe that that's the only gene therapy is your last step, is that something that you would consider for yourself or your family members? BJ brought this up. Does genetic modification influence our relationships with our relatives? How might that change? So I'm suggesting here that we hear a lot from our tribal communities that we are relatives with species, trees, plants, animals. What does that really mean when we're talking about biotechnology? And it makes the ethics of these discussions they're already difficult and complicated for the general population, but when we're talking about people that many believe that these are our relatives, what does that mean when we ask or move forward with projects that are going to alter them at a fundamental level? Now I'm just going to share a little story here from the University of Minnesota, tribes here and wild rice. And this is around genetic modification and controversies that have arisen here in the state. Monoman is wild rice. This is a picture I took on the Fond du Lac Reservation, and what you can see a little bit of water there kind of in the middle. Essentially, that's all wild rice on the other side of those shrubs. That's a huge lake filled with beautiful monoman. This is a relative to the Ojibwe people, to the Potawatomi people, to our tribes that live in the region where this rice grows. Right? It's culturally important. Many stories. We've heard two presentations, both Neil and BJ talked about original stories. Right? This wild rice, this monoman, is incorporated in many traditional stories. It's also historically important for food, right? This is as tribes were being removed, as tribes have had social and economic pressures put on them through colonization. This is a source of food that has sustained people, right? So this is historically, culturally important. It's economically important. It's sacred. It's a relative, right? And the Ojibwe people and our other tribes in this region have knowledge about this monoman. They know about different varieties. They know how it grows on different lakes. They have a lot of understanding of this. And tribes themselves, and again, we've heard this in the other presentations, tribes have a responsibility to protect that monoman, to protect their relative. And the tribes themselves have been fighting to do this for decades at this point, fighting for, how does contaminants affect it? How does water runoff? How does development impact this? And they've also been fighting against biotechnology and plant breeding pertaining to this monoman. So in the 70s, the University of Minnesota began working with wild rice cultivation and commercialization to develop strains of wild rice, paddy rice, rice that could be sold, could be harvested mechanically, and then sold onto the market. Tribes were really not part of those discussions. And then in the late 1980s, they started doing, they mapped the genome, started mapping the genome, and started the biotechnology to improve even more the varieties that they could grow commercially. And tribes here objected strongly to this. Here's a quote from a letter that the president at the time of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe said in a letter to the University of Minnesota: "We object to the exploitation of our wild rice for pecuniary gain. We are of the opinion that wild rice rights assured by treaty accrue not only to the individual grains of rice, but to the very essence of the resource." They were objecting to genetic engineering. The bottom line for the tribes is that they did not want the university or anyone else to manipulate their relative at the genetic level, or even with breeding, right? You see the pecuniary gain. They did the commercialization of their relative. Again, if you take seriously the idea that this is a relative, what does that mean to be selling your relative in this manner? Right. Another concern that tribes have about rice is the pollen, and Neil brought that up. So we do have cultivated rice. A current concern of tribes is what happens with those genes and how they mix. How far does that pollen go? Can it contaminate the stands of rice that are wild? Again, each lake has different varieties. There's different flavors. There's different characteristics. And the tribes know about that. And there's a concern that pollen will end up altering those relatives. The university has been meeting with the tribes every 2 years in a conference called Nibi Manoman, Water and Rice, to talk about these issues. It's been going on for a decade. I bring this up because this working with tribes takes time. And there's been setbacks and advances and setbacks. But yeah, so over a decade, the university has been working with tribes on this. So I recognize that forest health concerns in biotechnology are different than commercialization of things that are sacred like wild rice. However, I think we need to ask, what is the difference here? You know, are there differences? I think there probably are, but answer the question, are there differences between biotechnology to support forest health and biotechnology for monoman for commercial use? And the only way we can answer this question is to have partnerships with tribes. The only way we can answer these questions is to partner with tribes. I have papers, I have information. If the committee is interested in learning more about building partnerships with tribes, I can share that, examples, and I guess a study that I did last year in the Journal of Forestry that outlines how to build examples to build partnerships with tribes. Okay, to start wrapping up here, answering a couple of the questions here. Many communities I work with talk about forest health being the same as community health, meaning people, right? Our communities and the forest are the same. If one is healthy, the other is healthy. Healthy forest means diverse forest, means keeping all those pieces. Healthy forest means respecting the forest, recognizing our responsibilities to forests and each other. The idea of reciprocity is part of that. And that our responsibility and reciprocity has to do also with our future generations and future generations of our plant and animal relatives. So this is a common, forest health and community health are linked. That's a common perspective among tribal communities. Finally, this is my last kind of point here about thought about invasive species a little bit. Here are some Potawatomi tribal members with beautiful black ash baskets. I noticed at the start of the program, I think it was an ash tree with some emerald ash borer damage on it, on the picture. Invasive species are a huge issue for tribes. They're impacting ecosystems. This is not only hurting sort of the ecological functions, but it's hurting tribal connection with those plants. It's impacting our cultures. You know, how do you transmit basket making knowledge if you have no material to make the basket, right? It's also our TEK that's being impacted. But our TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, excuse me, and our understanding of the ecosystem can really help when we decide how are we going to deal with these issues, right? Real briefly, in Canada, right after emerald ash borer was found, those tribal lands, Potawatomi lands, right on the other side of the U.S. border, the Canadian government's response to stop the spread was to just cut a huge swath, cut every ash tree out of a several-mile swath. That was right across tribal lands. Tribes really didn't have a lot of input into it. In fact, their input was, don't do that. Let's think about a different way. And sure enough, after that, you know, basically every ash tree was cut on these tribal forests, it was found on the other side. It didn't work, right? Those tribes were not involved in that discussion in order to do that. And so I think we can learn from that and incorporate start dialogues with tribes around these issues and how to move forward and where it makes sense and where it doesn't make sense. So to conclude, I'll say there's no one tribal voice. We need to listen to tribal perspectives, but there's many, many of these perspectives. And the way to do that is building relationships with tribal partners. This is going to vary by scale, right? There's some, you know, national level stuff that we can talk about, but there's also regional and local things. You know, chestnut is not found everywhere in the United States, right? So that makes more, and tribes that don't live with chestnut don't have the same experience as tribes that live with chestnut and have had that in their territories, right? There's a scale issue there. Tribes have been excluded in biotech conversations in the past. And again, I applaud the committee for bringing us in and hearing from us. But this is going to take time. It's going to take leadership, and it's going to take understanding different perspectives. What does it mean to be a relative? What does it mean to manage and work with your relatives? I think if we incorporate tribal perspectives in these discussions, we're going to come up with better solutions, and we're going to come up with it together so we can all move forward and deal with these serious issues that we're facing. So with that, I have a nice Minnesota picture with me and my kids on the ice riding bicycles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Do we have any quick questions of clarification for Mike? Okay, hearing none, then we'll open it up for general questions for all three speakers from the committee.
Hello, this is Inés Ibayev from the University of Michigan, and I have a question for probably the three speakers. I'm a forest ecologist, and I would be curious to know if you could tell us about some of the approaches that tribes may be already implemented or thinking about implemented conservation and management approaches to deal with the impact of global change on forest ecosystems. And thinking about global change as fragmentation, pollution, new introductions, and also climate change. So I would be curious to know what those approaches could be. Thank you.
Hi,
Neil,
this is Neil. Just a quick something that I thought of right away as that question came up was culturally assisted migration. And so for our people, we have a long history not only of breeding plants, but also moving plants. There's, you know, the butternut tree in particular and black walnut. You know, a lot of anthropologists have documented, you know, extensively the movement of that tree by Haudenosaunee people to the north. And so it's one of these resiliency and sort of, in a way, mitigation sort of strategies by indigenous people is often to move plants into our territories, to adopt them, bring them in as we would any other relative, as Mike points out, and make them part of our lives. So I know that's a common sort of idea that's talked about in terms of, climate change as well. So I just wanted to add that quickly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
this is Mike. I'll add as well. Many of our tribal communities are working on climate adaptation plans. They're adapting their forest management practices to incorporate uncertainty and try to anticipate future change. It's a huge concern for tribal communities, climate change, as well as invasive species. There's a tribe here in Minnesota who's working, actually doing experiments, common garden type experiments, to find tree species that will grow in the ash swamps when emerald ash borer reduces the native ash population. And they're doing, just like any other scientists would do, they're planting rows, they're planting in different spaces, they're planting different species to see what will grow best. And the goal of that isn't to just publish research. The goal of that is to maintain ecosystem function in ash swamps when ash is no longer growing there. Again, tribes are forward thinking in how they're using their knowledge. And another example is tribes managing to maintain diversity on the landscape. And the idea is that if we maintain all these pieces in the ecosystem, we maintain that diversity, our forests will be more resilient to change. And so you see tribes like the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, who has managed their forests sustainably for timber and other benefits over 100 years. They've managed it longer than anyone else has in the United States. That's where forestry really started, the cutting trees for timber. And they're able to do that in a way that their goal is to maintain diversity, to deal with uncertainty and change. They're also using, as science moves forward, they're using that. So Menominee's doing, I know them because I worked with them quite a bit. I see one of the foresters online here too. They've been doing experiments about, again, what trees are going to grow best in a climate change situation. They have oak wilt in one part, planting different types of trees to see what's going to grow best as the climate is predicted to dry out in certain areas or get wetter in others. Modern inventory is really important for a lot of tribal management. Maintaining, what do we have there? How is it changing through time? And how can we use that understanding to make decisions?
Thank you.
BJ, did you want to add anything?
Yes, just quite simply, we're seeing the migration of different bugs and birds and other relatives that are slowly moving themselves. Plants may be a little bit slower. I know I lived in Western North Carolina, and there was a plant that was only native to a certain area, and all of a sudden it was a garlic mustard. It could be pretty invasive, but it was moving into that area and never before was native. So we have to look to nature too, because nature is intuitive. It's more intuitive than we are. So maybe some more examination in the migration of our relatives on their own. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Jason, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thanks to all three speakers for joining us today. I have a specific question for Neil, but perhaps Mike or BJ would want to comment too. I'm really interested in, Neil, in what you talked about in terms of envisioning a process for working out the words for things like biotechnology or genetic engineering, or other types of emerging technologies around forestry especially. And I'm wondering if you can imagine a way where indigenous and Western science expertise could work together in that process, or do you feel like that's a process of working out those words that really needs to happen just within your communities and not including other types of expertise that are outside of those communities?
But yeah, I think that it's an iterative process, and it reminds me a bit of sort of multi-criteria analysis, where you kind of come up with some basic criteria about how you form a word and formulate a new word in an indigenous culture, and then you go back and you gather more information, and then you come back, because that word may actually change. That word, in our language at least, is so malleable, and the concepts that it changes over time. And so I think scientific knowledge certainly is part of that, understanding the difference between transgenic and cisgenic and back crossbreeding. But what it boils down to, I think, ultimately, and you know, understanding sort of the process and the technology involved is important, but what's more important is the relationship. And we see that with new words like for railroads, and you know, I think, you know, a perspective on biotechnology is simply that we have no word for genetically modified in our language. And so how can we have a perspective on it if we don't have a way to refer to it? And so how we refer to it naturally is just as any young baby or child would, in terms of saying, you know, that one of the first words that children learn is their relatives, actually, mommy or daddy. And so in that sort of way, this is a very new relative coming in, if you will, and it's just in the same way that a young child would, or, you know, somebody in their infancy would be able to say, this is how I relate to you. And the relationship is what's important, because our people have used chestnut for so long for medicine. They use different parts of the tree for medicine, as well as food. And so food and medicine are one of the dominant relationships we have with the species. And so in that way, we have a tall order to restore that relationship. And so our work actually, in many ways, is thinking about what is our relationship to the original chestnut, which has been gone for so long. And we are fortunate to have, you know, that's one thing I was thinking about as Mike was talking about, you know, at least in the East, and when you think about the map that he provided, a lot of our perspectives on forests are completely driven by forests now under the control or management of non-tribal entities, like the Forest Service or like the states themselves. And so this is why customary use is so critical, a critical part of the equation, in addition to that scientific knowledge.
So I have a point for Neil also. Can you hear me? It's Ron Sederoff.
Yes.
I'm impressed with the interest in the concept of language, and perhaps what needs to be brought into the discussion is the extent to which DNA itself is a language. It has a grammar, it evolves, it has dialects, it has words and paragraphs. It reflects the relationship of our entire history and essentially proves the relationship between people and their plants and their animals. It would be very interesting to try to integrate the historical perspective of indigenous people with the perspective of the biological language.
I think you're right, Ron, and I think that the slight nuance, maybe it's a major nuance, that indigenous people have, is that the biological and the physical are not separated. And so the expression of that language and those paragraphs and those thoughts and ideas are not seen as something that is completely determined by a genetic code. And I think that's what is a little bit unique with the tribal perspective, is that the perspective is embedded in our creation story and in our politic itself on how we relate to each other, as well as the purely, sort of fundamental biological ways in which we relate to each other.
Additional questions from the committee?
I guess I have a general question for all the speakers, and that is, it's a fundamental one about providing common ground from which discussions can begin, because too much of the time we can be talking about the same experiments but come to different conclusions, and there is a serious gap with respect to what we consider the nature of evidence, or what we consider to be information rather than opinion. How do we come to a place where we can agree on what's reliable and what isn't? Because without having common rules from which to make conclusions, we can't have, there's no basis for discussion. How do we get to common ground?
Ron, this is Neil. Just quickly, that is the million-dollar question, especially today, as BJ points out, in such a polarized political world. But one of the ways I find it very useful in thinking about research involving Indigenous people, because there's such a dramatic increase in interest in traditional knowledge, is to sit down together at the very beginning of the process and form a sort of autoethnographical admission up front, and to sit down between researchers and subjects and between disciplines and different groups of people, and to say, this is why I'm here, this is my intent. And it just fits so well with, at least for Haudenosaunee country and many Indigenous cultures across North America, is the very first step is to introduce yourself and to understand the background and the upbringing that the individual has or the organization has, and the purpose for which they're beginning this research question. And I think too often that is not done. And I think Mike's paper that he's referring to on consultation with Indigenous communities on forest health and are evidence of that is not something that's part of the scientific process right now. To be very clear about our intentions going in, and that's something we're really focusing here at ESF on in thinking about restoration, is to lay it on the table and to describe who we are and where we come from and our inherent biases that we bring to the table.
That's great, Neil. This is Mike. I was thinking a similar thing, although you were a lot more eloquent than I think I can be. I was thinking having discussions about what the real problem is and what are we trying to solve, right? And then the step beyond that, or maybe the step before that, is why is that problem a problem in the first place? So for example, I use this example. I was giving a talk yesterday at a climate change training that the Forest Service was doing. And a lot of times when I talk about climate change, with tribal communities. I've held lots of meetings, lots of meetings, lots of discussions around climate change with tribes from all over. And oftentimes, very, very, very often, I'm talking about climate change, or the scientific climate specialist is talking about climate change. And then the questions start and the discussion starts, and it's, okay, it starts maybe with climate change, and then there are questions about the ozone. And then there are questions about pollution. And then there are questions about garbage, maybe that's being dumped down the road. And there are questions about invasive species, about water runoff, about education, all these things. And what that tells me, and when you dig deeper, it's climate change might be the problem one group is working on, right? But what's behind that? And for these tribal communities, often it's the relationship that we have with those relatives, with those resources, and with each other have been broken or need help. We need to focus our energy on our relationships. And I think BJ's discussion, that was hitting home to me when when it was brought up that the commercialization of things, right? Globalization has been a problem that's causing a number of symptoms, including climate change and invasive species. So if we have discussions and build those relationships with tribes about what is the actual problem, and then why is the problem being caused, then we can have a solution that works to solve the actual problem. But it's hard, you're right, I agree. It's a difficult question if you define the problem differently. And even if we say climate change is a problem and tribes recognize that, I'm not necessarily sure that the reason for that problem in people's minds is the same. And until we understand each other, until we really truly listen and respect each other's perspectives, it'll be hard to move forward.
This is BJ, and when Ron asked that question, my first thought was that we are all related. Ron is my relation, as well as Neil and Mike and everybody listening today. And we have to keep in mind that our objectives are for the next 7 generations. What we're doing today, we may not see the results of that, but we can't act on that knowledge. And so if we can really and truly make those connections with each other, whether it be with an indigenous panel or with non-indigenous people, I always say to people that everybody was indigenous to begin with. So get in touch, find out what your indigenous connections are. And I think if we can just kind of take it down a notch and remind people that we are related to not only each other, but everything in this creation, and that we as humans are really just a very small part of it. And if we go away today, mother and the rest of her children are they're gonna be just fine. So what we're really doing is we're working to save the human race ultimately. So just remind everybody that we really are brothers and sisters and cousins and all that.
This is Richard Snesko, and BJ, I think you alluded to this a little bit, but I'd like to maybe hear all three of you too. It seems like part of it is making sure things are looking at holistically. You mentioned, for instance, with chestnut, is it possible that more conventional breeding, given time, could work? Could breeding avenue be sped up and everything else too? If the first question we ever ask is, hey, there's a biotech solution for it. Well, is that the only solution? Is it the best solution? If it's truly the only solution, I don't know, maybe indigenous peoples will consider it, but maybe part of it is, are we jumping in line here? And do we truly look at things holistically and weigh everything? So
Yeah, that's a good question. We, when we work with our elders and councils and stuff, we can't expect instant answers. And a lot of times when we go to an elder, an auntie, and we pose a question or a problem or bring them a dream, they don't give us their perspective immediately. They think on it. So working holistically is another element of being related. So yeah, I don't know if biotechnology was the only answer. I can't say. I would like to think that we would have another option. So I hope I answered your question. If not,
Well, kind of. And I guess the point I want to make in a webinar I gave earlier in December, I gave some examples and I filled in some questions. And there was one example of Port Over Cedar where the early work, it was in the literature, there is no resistance. And since subsequently we have found it. And I said, it would have looked silly to society if we had jumped to a biotech solution and said there's no resistance. And then later had shown there's actually a fair amount of resistance out there. And whatever too. So, part of it is being thorough and weighing the options and laying it out there for whatever the stakeholders to do. But we need to be thorough in the process of doing it and not come back later and say, oh, my bad. We really did find an alternative, but we didn't look hard enough.
Hello.
Go ahead, Jean.
Hi. As we're talking here, I think possibly one opportunity for common ground is this very topic. For the chestnut, for example, the example that most people have heard about, it is not that tree breeding doesn't work or plant breeding fails. It's that there are a number of reasons why progress to date has been a bit slow for some impatient people. But it seems to me that one can use some of the tools of genetics and genomics to make the plant breeding process more efficient without introducing any transgenes or foreign, quote unquote, DNA into the genome other than that of the Chinese chestnut donor. And we could even have a discussion on that. Is that all right to do that? I think we should have these discussions, and we should not be ruling each other out before we ever speak.
Jason, you have a question?
I do, but did any of the guests want to respond to Jean's comment? Okay.
This is Mike. I think the discussion is where it has to start, and maybe specifically around chestnut. That's good, but it's yeah. So none of us can speak to say that, oh yeah, the tribes are going to do this or think about that, except if we actually have discussions with different tribes. And again, it's a thing of scale because so chestnut, as Neil showed, had a large range. Potentially working with chestnut could have impacts for many, many tribes throughout that range. And so it's not it's going to be a difficult thing to get that discussion. But again, I believe that we need to have these discussions and build relationships, because this is me talking here for myself, but I think that the only way forward with dealing with some of our environmental problems and our social problems is to work together. And the only way to work together is to build our relationships with each other. And so those discussions are a good place to start.
Yeah, this is BJ. Real quick to talk to the last person that had a question or a comment. I like to refer to Jack Weatherford's book, The Indian Givers, where one of his theories is that Machu Picchu was an agricultural research station where they bred different plants and food to cover their huge territory. So indigenous peoples have been breeding plants and creating foods and medicines that we've needed for thousands of years. So, you know, I think it's something, and as Mike said, that, you know, we need to have this discussion with the tribes and with the people of those traditional lands. But there is a lot of evidence that we have a historical experience with plant breeding.
Yeah, that's a really important point, right? Corn, and seeing how corn and the different varieties of corn have moved and been, you know, by people, our people, breeding different varieties, getting it to work in northern Wisconsin. It's amazing. So yes, that's a great point. Tribes have been consciously moving and working with plants for history, for all time.
Yes. Yes.
So this is Jason Delhorn, and I want to ask a question and then a question about the question. So the question that I had thought about early in the talk is, you know, if there were these discussions that we were able to start, you know, with indigenous communities thinking about chestnut restoration, and the choice between, you know, doing nothing or using a hybrid that, you know, was made with the Chinese chestnut through traditional breeding, or the genetically modified American chestnut that's resistant to blight, what might that discussion look like? And the question I have about that question is, are we too late because we already have the technology developed? And is the sort of framing of that set of questions for discussion already off base? You know, given what Neil and Mike were saying earlier about the importance of sort of the framing of the problem, the framing of solutions, is assuming that that's the right question. Is that incorrect? And are there other ways to begin the discussion when, you know, maybe it should have started a while ago?
This is Neil. I have a quick comment, maybe addressing the last few questions. You know, and I think people who look at traditional knowledge and how it's formulated and where it lies and who has access to it and who are the authorities with, you know, tribal perspectives on biotechnology. You know, as I mentioned, they're sort of embedded both at the very start in our creation story, but secondarily, they're also embedded in our political procedures and what we would call political duties and responsibilities. And one of those duties, one of those responsibilities is to think about the question in terms of how it affects the peace. And that has been, for at least in this part of the world, you know, the dominant question is not so much what technologies do we embrace or reject, but how do these technologies affect the peace? And I think the culturally assisted migration of plants and plant breeding and, you know, the references BJ mentioned, they're all leading towards this notion of peace. And that is a concept that I don't think biotechnologists are equipped or ready to deal with, because it's seen as part of social science, or it's seen as public policy or something outside of their realm. But that is a responsibility of every human being. And that's something that, you know, I think as we move forward, and the chestnut is a great example because it's, you know, I think in the terms of biotechnology for the notion of profit, we know how profit affects the peace. But biotechnology, in terms of restoration of ecosystem and restoration of relationship with place, that's a much more difficult question to address in the framework of peace. And so I just wanted to add that there are existing sort of litmus tests for indigenous people across the world, actually, that are built into their political, systems and political ideologies. And for us, that really focuses on peace.
Does BJ or Mike, do you want to respond to Jason's question?
Yeah, this BJ. In the context of being too late because the technology or the tree or the organism already exists, it should be left up to the traditional landholders. So, when it's time to, put those GE trees out, permission needs to be asked. And to Neil's point, the peace, I think he was also referring to the peace in the ecosystem, in the biodiversity, if it's going to create any upheavals or changes that will bring any undesirable results or consequences. I could be wrong, but the peace is also might be interrupted or changed during the discussions as well on who's talking and what council or clan or community. So it's a big issue. We got a lot of work to do.
All right, we have time for one more question from the committee, if there is one. Okay, hearing none, I'd just like to say thank you once again to Neil, BJ, and Mike for taking the time to join us today, and to everybody on the line who also took time from their day to listen to this conversation. We appreciate it, and we hope you'll stick with us through the rest of the report process and look for the report at the end of 2018. I'd like to also remind you that we have our next webinar on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern, when we will hear from representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So thank you again, and have a good weekend.